My dudes, what's happening? My name is Trent. I have been a concept artist in the video game industry for 20 years now. I've done a lot of landscape paintings. I've done a lot of environment concept art for very popular video games. And I have broken down my system, my process, into a very precise process. And I'm gonna explain all of it to you, all my secrets here in this 30-minute video. Normally, a piece like this would take me a few hours, but I've broken everything down into very bite-sized, concise tutorials so that you can follow along, you can increase your speed. Obviously, the goal isn't just to paint faster, but I think that maybe by me sharing my process and how I do this and some of the things I've learned, maybe there's something you could pick up and apply into your own workflow. If not, that's cool too, whatever. Hopefully, this will help you in some way or another. And dudes, enough of me yapping, let's dive into the tutorial. Let's do it. Now, to do a job like this, I was sent a MSI Creator 17 laptop. So that's what I'm gonna be using. This is just the 500 gigabyte version. And I've got myself a Wacom N2OS Pro here with I think this is the 2.0 pen that I'm using here. This is a bit of an advanced tutorial, so you should probably already know that you're gonna need some kind of a pen input device, whether it's an iPad or whether it's any other software. Everything I'm gonna teach you can translate to just about any painting program. And this is a 17-inch display, and man, it is vibrant, very high resolution display. Nice cinematic widescreen, which is very, very handy when you're doing these cinematic kind of a landscape environment paintings, like what I do for my profession for all the games that I work on. I also love that underlit keyboard. It's really nice when you're doing those late night painting sessions, which I find myself doing an awful lot. I've been surprised throughout this process at just how powerful this little laptop computer is. It kind of functions as a base station, as a workstation for running really high resolution paintings here. And I'm using Photoshop, and obviously you can see my Wacom N2OS Pro off to the side there. This painting is inspired by a lot of the games that I've worked on, Fortnite, World of Warcraft. I wanted to create a fantasy dreamscape, something that felt like a whimsical, imaginative world that I would want to explore. So you've got cool little walkways here and all kinds of little lived-in things, lived-in elements that are going to give the viewer a sense that people live here, and there's a lot of storytelling involved in every environment that I've ever designed for every video game. So I want to dig in a little bit on that throughout this tutorial. The total painting time was only a few hours, but that's because I did a lot of prep work, and I'm gonna kind of walk you through a lot of the things that I do to save a ton of time as well. So when I start a landscape painting, I start out with just grayscale, 3 layers of depth at minimum. And ultimately, what we're aiming for is something where we've got a really dark foreground, we've got a medium dark middle ground, and as things get further into the distance, they become lighter and lighter because our atmosphere, our sky is going to be a light sky. I'm only looking at values in composition here. I'm trying to keep it pretty much just grayscale. And the reason for this is that I don't want to get bogged down too much with colors or lighting too much, just values. It's just a value read. I'm really only using 2 tools here, which is basically the selection tool, the lasso tool, and an airbrush. And I'm working on multiple different layers so that I can move around and adjust my layer depth and adjust the composition. So you'll see me making a selection and then I'll slide that around. And I want to have a nice flow to everything. I don't want to have an imbalance. You want to have a nice balance of large shapes and a nice empty space through the middle to create this nice feeling of a valley. And then these lines across are ropes and rope bridges. And they're gonna give the whole piece a little bit of a feeling of story and a feeling that the world is lived in a little bit without going too much into architecture or anything like that. I want to make a few selections and then hit it with an airbrush for a lighter color so that there's a feeling that there are multiple layers of depth as these canyons are going further into the distance, and there may even be some mist in the air, lots of particles bouncing light from underneath. And you'll notice that there's still a bit of a perspective here, so it feels like the canyon is closing in towards the bottom right of the image. I also wanted to have some really big pine trees. Put a few in the foreground here, and then medium-sized trees in the middle ground. And then as you'll see later, I even add in some smaller trees of the same style of tree up way back in the distance so that there's a feeling that things in the foreground are larger and things that are way back in the distance are smaller. And they're familiar, they're the same item, and that gives us a real sense of depth. Be sure you have the same kind of trees, man, because if you suddenly put in a totally different tree back in the distance, and then there's no sense of depth or scale here going on. So that really helps with the sense of scale. But this could be anything. This could be houses or structures, something familiar, as long as you have a very large object in the foreground, and then as you get further into the distance, they get smaller and smaller. At this point, you're free to completely add a bunch of details, including bushes and other kinds of trees and grass and rock formations, or maybe even start to imply some clouds, or start to imply some railings or rope bridges, more elements to show that this is an environment where people traverse this land. Now for this shot, I want to make sure that there's a lot of water splashing up from underneath, and I want that light to feel like it's underlighting a lot of the rocks on these rock walls. So I'm going to light all these rocks from underneath rather than coming down from the top. I also think sometimes underlighting something can really give it a mystical, magical feeling, and I really want this valley to feel like there's a lot of light down in there. Doing this in grayscale before you even go to color allows you to be free to just think about the storytelling of your environment and how people might traverse this landscape. This thumbnail was done in about 20 to 30 minutes, and it has all of the information necessary for one, just showing it to a client, or just using it as a groundwork to decide what kind of color vibe you want to do for your mood and atmosphere. All right, speaking of which, let's dig into that. To decide on your mood and atmosphere, you probably want to have a sky. And what I do is I take a very much a video game developer's approach to painting. So when I start an environment painting, I start by creating components. And these components, in this case, will be a sky. So I start with a gradient. And then just like how I was doing my values on my thumbnail, I will rotate the canvas using the R key and rotate the canvas. And then I will use the lasso to create the shape of these clouds. Note that I am on a new layer so that I can make adjustments to these clouds. And then I will fill them in using an airbrush. Note that the underside of the clouds are darker blue and the upper side of the clouds are going to be catching more light because the sun is above it, so they're going to be lighter. Then I go into that clouds layer and I will add some nice poofs and some wisps. You want some wisps in there. Your cloud bumps should not be all the same size either. Note that there are nice big fatty bumps and there are tiny little itty bitty bumps. Now the beauty of having your clouds on a separate layer from your gradient is that you can hit Command T and you can make adjustments. You can skew it and squeeze it and squash it and squish it. Now as your clouds get closer to the horizon or the bottom of the screen, they are definitely going to be thinner and more wispy, right? Because they are in perspective as well. So just like the trees, as clouds get further and further into the distance, they get smaller and narrower and thinner, right? And then we also want to have some nice darker clouds in the foreground, like they're almost maybe storm clouds underneath the shadow of the nice big fatty cloud. Now way back in the distance, we want to have an ocean and some mountains. So I've created another layer and I've laid down some nice blue. It's getting some clouds reflecting off of the surface of the water. And then I'm going to make a selection, hit that with an airbrush. We got ourselves a nice, awesome mountain range in the distance. Now note that the light is going to bounce off of the water and it's going to bounce up onto that almost flattened silhouette of a mountain way back in the distance. You can duplicate those mountains and change them using the transform tool, and then make a copy and then flip that vertically, and you got yourself a reflection on the water of the mountains on the horizon. Bam! Now we're gonna head on over back to our grayscale image that we have, and one of the things that we're gonna have to do, if we're gonna put that sky in here, we're gonna have to make sure that we cut out the sky from this image. Now, hey, if you already kept all your layers separate, you're in good shape, because all you got to do is drop that in. But if you made the mistake of flattening it, you're going to have to make a selection using the lasso tool and or the magic wand to cut that out. Once you've got a big sky hole in there, you can just drop in your clouds behind that, and then you can transform the entire folder full of your sky elements that you had. And you can skew it and squash it and stretch it. However it feels right. Don't have too many tangents where your clouds are touching elements of your foreground. Now you can go in with that eraser tool and just clean up any of those edges. Make sure that you got a nice clean cut so that if you can move your sky around however you want, and it'll keep those areas separate. So your background's separate from your foreground. This is also a good time to try to figure out where you want to put your horizon line. In this case, I have those mountains and where the mountains meet the ocean out there in the distance. And that's going to kind of define the horizon line. By the way, it's worth noting that it was intentional that I put that horizon line lower in the image because I want this to feel like we're looking up. Now for the most powerful tool in my arsenal, we're going to use the gradient map effect. Now this is found here down at the bottom. You want to click on this little button down here, and what that does is it maps a gradient onto the values of your painting. So your darkest values are going to be the color that's on the left. Your lightest values that are underneath it are going to be on the color on the right. So if you set that color on the right to a color, everything that's white is going to be that color. So that's one way to colorize all of your grayscale, but we don't want to do that on our sky layer. We want to do that on our foreground layer, right? Yeah, so we select the foreground layer and then we use our gradient map, and then we're going to select something with some blues in it because we want to get some nice blue from the sky on those rocks. And then we want it to fade off into a nice cooler blue, maybe like something that's icicle blue towards the bottom. And that's why we got a little bit of green at the bottom and of our lighter value scale, right? Of course, if you want to get my gradients, I do have those on my Gumroad as well, but you can make your own gradients and you can adjust them as needed per painting. The gradient map tool is such a powerful tool that sometimes I'll use it for the whole painting. So I'll just use a different gradient map for different elements. Here you can see that I'm repainting or mapping a blue, icicle blue gradient that I pre-made onto that waterfall. The other nice thing about the gradient map is that you can go in and make adjustments to it later. So if you're like, well, maybe that lighter color is just a little too light, or maybe I need the darkest values to go a little darker, you can just click on that little button of the icon of the color you want to change it, and anything that's mapped to that value scale will be shifted. The next step is to go in here and start to add some grass. I really want this to feel like a very lush kind of a chasm. It's not like a barren desert. We want to have some nice life going on here. So I'm going in with like a nice bright green because we want to get some nice bright sunlight going on here. I've made some selections and I've just filled it in with the airbrush. It can be very beneficial early on to keep all of your different elements on different layers. So for instance, if you have trees or more grass patches, you can just do that on one separate layer or in a folder group of layers, because that way you'll notice like you could just grab one and then copy and paste it over. You won't be able to do that if all of your grass is flattened onto the same layer as your rocks. Now I know that this valley, this chasm is going to be covered in pine trees, right? So I wanted to do a component that I can then copy and paste multiple times over. So I'm going to paint one really stylized tree that I can use several times over in my painting. For every component, you start with a sketch that shows you the turning of forms, the contours, how that shape of that cone is going to twist and turn. Then I figure out what's my mid-tone, okay? So the not in shadow and not highlighted color of green that is going to be covering most of the tree, and I create the silhouette of that tree. On a new layer underneath, you do the flats for the trunk of the tree, and then what we want to do is go in and start to add a gradient over the top. This is different from a gradient map. I'm just adding a little bit of subtle gradient so that the bottom part of the tree feels a little bit darker than the top part of the tree. At this point, I start to sketch in where I want all of those leaves to be hanging over. This is where sketching in those contours is going to come in handy, because in my mind, I can envision it a lot more clearly when I've drawn in those contours. I'm mostly using my handy chisel brush. That's like my favorite brush that I use. It's just a little bit of a chisel that you can rotate. And I use the selection tool with airbrush. And that's how I'm creating a little bit of extra shadow under each one of those pine branches. And something to keep in mind is when you're doing something like trees, don't make all of your branches the same exact size. You want to get a good variety in there. And this is something that I see a mistake that a lot of beginners will make, is that they'll just do one branch and then they kind of do all the branches the same size. And you want to make it an interesting tree too. I mean, this is very much a stylized kind of an approach, but I like to have a nice like swirl or angular dynamic to my tree. I don't want to just do something that's like a perfect triangle. I think that that's something that as you start to paint more and more, you add a little bit of your own flavor and interest to trees. It's no secret that like Tim Burton trees are not realistic, and that's part of what makes them so darn iconic. I'm a big fan of the weird, get funky with it, but you still need to apply some of the rules of lighting, and that's why I'm hitting some of these tips. I'm frosting my tips of the branches with a little bit of a highlighted color. If you're going to use a highlighted color on something like a tree branch, then it's a good idea to add just a little bit of color variation towards the tips so that you've got, for instance, if the light is hitting this green, it's going to add a little bit of yellow to it if the sun is warm, for example. But keep in mind, we do want to keep that lower part of the tree a little bit more in shadow. Keep that gradient over the whole thing. So that's why I'm hitting the bottom with a big fat airbrush. And this is also very beneficial, by the way, if all of that is on a separate layer so that you can make a selection and not have to worry about repainting something that you've already painted again. Okay, it's a good thing we have that tree trunk on a separate layer. We're going to do the same thing. So you find yourself a nice highlighted color, add maybe just a little bit of that warmer light to it, but I've also desaturated the browns. I found that with browns, a lot of times it's really just a very desaturated red, and color is all relative anyway. And bing, bang, and a boom, you got yourself a tree that's on your component sheet. Now, what I like to do is I create a whole sheet full of all the components that I'm going to be using in my painting. So here on the left, you can see a sheet that I have full of different components, from grass to various different types of trees and rocks. And I'm just going to grab that pine tree and I'm going to put that into the foreground here. And I'm going to increase the size on some of them and give it a nice variety so that they're not all exactly the same. I'm going to make sure that I put all my trees into a trees folder. And then I've got these background trees. I'm going to just move those around, really kind of matching up, lining up really just with my sketch. But of course, now that I have these trees with a lot more fidelity and detail, it's probably a good idea to go back and erase out my sketch trees. So I'm just grabbing like a eraser, plain old eraser here, and just erasing it out. That way also, the sky, this is a good thing that I've got that sky on a separate layer back there, because as I'm erasing things out using the selection tool and just a brush tool, a brush eraser, we see the sky and the clouds. I don't have to repaint that. So I've erased out, and I'm going to add in a lot more atmospheric diffusion. And that basically just means that the sky and the mist and the fog is going to be affecting the trees that are further into the background. So I've got them selected, and when I have them selected, I can hit it with an airbrush. The sky the blue from the sky is going to be affecting it so that it's going to feel less intense. It's also going to lower the contrast, so that's also going to make it feel like it's further in the background. But then also I've got a little bit of that misty blue coming up from underneath, and that's going to separate it from the rocky shapes, and also it's going to make it feel like there's light bouncing up onto those trees. From the grass up on that higher elevation. Light is always bouncing off of everything, remember that, especially if in a brightly lit environment. And even more so in a brightly lit environment where there's a lot of mist in the air, for example, like this shot. So this tree is a little bit different, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the liquefy tool to squash it and stretch it to get more variety out of this particular tree. So the liquefy tool can be found in filters and then liquefy. That pulls up this really awesome screen where you can imagine it like it's mapped your image onto a t-shirt, and you're just taking your finger and squeezing it around so that you can really manipulate it to get a totally different look for the same tree. Now, if one were so inclined, you could do that with almost all of your trees and get yourself a lot of variety. And you're gonna probably wanna go in and do that with a few brush strokes anyway. I mean, even though we're cut and pasting a lot of trees here and a lot of rocks and things, you know, is wherever you can to kind of cover that up and not show it is a good idea. The key with digital art is to reuse as much as possible without making it look like you're reusing as much as possible. You know what I'm saying? The client usually doesn't really care. What they care about is the impact of the final image. Like, is this a really cool location or space? And that's going to be a combination of your lighting and your storytelling and the designs that you're actually creating. Remember how we were separating our trees up on that cliff up in the top left? We're going to do that all along the bottom trees as well, so that we can really create a feeling that there's a lot of mist in the air, and that mist is bouncing a lot of light up onto those trees from underneath. All right. While I'm showing off all of my favorite tricks, I want to show you how to replace colors. That's actually a feature. You go up here to Image, Replace Color. Now, you can only replace a color that is on the layer you have selected. So you might have to flatten the image to do this, which can be just pretty destructive. But you can select any color on that layer, and you can move the slider to change the hue, the saturation, or just make it lighter or darker. That's a pretty handy trick, because if your values are in place, then it doesn't matter. You can change your colors later. It's super useful, especially if you're trying to get a very magical looking environment. In this case, I took the misty underside underlighting and I added just a little bit of green to that, and then I made a little bit of a darker value for the cracks between the rocks. So when you're doing a painting like this, you want to work from broad strokes to detailed strokes. And as we've mostly set up everything with good planning from our rough sketch phase all the way up to figuring out what kind of lighting we want in our shot, figuring out our misty colors, and even as we even began to start to add all that atmospheric diffusion in to keep the depth there. But now everything is about really refining things and adding a little bit more subtleties to things. So for instance, as things get further into the background, it's okay if they flatten out a little bit and just become almost a gradient. So these trees back here can be clustered together, and you can hit it with a little bit of an airbrush to add a softer transition so that those details aren't high contrast. Remember that elements that are in your foreground are going to have high contrast of values, so a broad range of light to dark, and elements that are way back in the distance are going to have less and less contrast in value, almost to the point where some of your background elements are going to feel like they're flat, like cards in a, if you've ever seen those shadow boxes, they're almost like cardboard cutouts that are resting in the distance. The closer they get to the camera, they have more detail. The further they are back in the distance, the less detail and the less contrast they have. Because atmosphere is in between all of it. There's all these particles everywhere. There's dust in the air, there's mist, obviously, in this shot. There's clouds, and clouds and mist kind of behave the same way, really. It's also not a bad idea to take some of those larger shapes that you've got and start to add a little bit of that underlighting, really amplify that, bring that up. As I've brought in some of that cool blue mist along the bottom, along those pine trees, it's going to be bouncing more light up onto those undersurfaces of these rocks that are sticking out from this rock wall, this chasm wall. And if that fog layer gets in the way, you can just make that invisible while you're working underneath it, and then you can turn that fog layer back on after you've done rendered. I've been recording a lot today. After you've done rendered a whole lot of them rare rocks, you can switch that fog layer right back on. All right, yeah. All right, dudes, almost everything is in place now. Like, we've been thinking in terms of sketching and planning, but now it's time to cut loose and actually get into the painting and the rendering. This is really my favorite part of the painting process because so much of the thinking is done. Now it's just about the fun of closing your eyes and imagining you're there. So how would grass grow onto these surfaces? If this is a lush environment with lots of water, natural water and waterfalls, you're probably going to have all this grass growing up onto these flat surfaces where the rocks have outcropped. You're going to have a lot of shadow underneath this outcropping. You're going to have some of these railings where characters may have set up rails so that they could walk down there or walk along these narrow pathways along the rock wall. And if they do, you know, they might even hang some lanterns and things like that. So playing around with that space and really starting to think about how people would live here and if there are resources. And if there are resources, well, then would they mine those resources or would they collect them? And you might want to put in a large magical crystal. I used to work on World of Warcraft, so my default was always, when I did a lot of landscapes, I would always just put like a magical crystal somewhere in the world. If you've seen a lot of magical crystals in World of Warcraft, you know what I'm talking about. And I was responsible for a lot of them. They're magical crystals. That was my sort of default go-to for just coming up with something interesting in your environment. But it doesn't have to be that. It can be anything you want. You could build structures, you could build castles into these walls or into these outcroppings. You could build small warlike structures if they had a lot of ships coming through here. Maybe that they would have catapults or trebuchets or cannons or something like mounted up here onto these rocks. This could be any kind of a starting for any kind of a scene. And that's why it's good to build those components of trees and grass and rocks so that when you are tasked with doing something like a structure in a natural environment like this, you've already got all these resources. You don't need to spend 4 days painting the same rocks that you've painted 200 times. And maybe this is just because I've been doing this for 20 years, but yeah, man, I've painted more rocks than I've done of anything else, because at some point you're painting a castle in a structure in an environment, and you've got to have rocks, you've got to have grass, you've got to have trees. These are just the fun details. This is the part where I'm adding little highlights to the corners of rocks and making sure that my underlighting is consistent and imagining that there's almost, this water is like almost magical water. It's going to be bouncing up an awful lot. And I think I'm mostly just using my chisel brush through most of this, but you can use whatever brush you want. You know, I also use the hard square set with pressure set to opacity. Oh, there's little cracks in these walls, and I wanted to make sure that this underlighting is really kind of creating these nice little highlighted edges along the bottoms of these rocks. Not to mention hitting it with like a spatter brush. I've got a few of these in my brush set as well, but basically just any old spatter brush kind of an effect is really going to come in really handy here, especially if you got waterfalls with just lots of water splashing around. And yeah, it creates a nice atmosphere. At this point, the vision of the scene really started to come together, and I realized I really want a lot of vegetation and just life in here. So I grabbed another tree that I used from some of my other components for landscapes, and I popped that in over here. This was done the same way that I had done that pine tree. Now, it is tricky when you start to put in too many different types of trees, and I wouldn't do too many. I wouldn't do more than like 2 or 3 different types. And keep in mind, this is a foreground tree, so it's got to be in shadow, and it's got to be a lot darker. And mostly this is just to really separate it from the background elements. So you'll also notice that the green in this tree is going to be a little bit more bluish. It's going to have a little bit more blue because it's in shadow, and I really want to differentiate it from the bright green grass that's growing all over those rocks in the background. I also wanted to update some of my rocks, so I imported some of these rock wall studies that I had done for my components sheet, and I'm popping them in. These are all my own paintings, by the way. I want to clarify. I'm not photo bashing, I'm not using other people's art. I only ever use and reuse my own artwork, unless of course I'm working with a team on a painting. So I just need to do the color replace, which was a trick that I showed you earlier in this video, and then I'm erasing out, and you can see how I'm matching it to the lighting that I had set up for that underlighting so that it looks like those edges are popping out. And then I also, what's beautiful about this is that I get to keep that texture of the rock that I had painted, and it adds this nice subtlety to it. This particularly works really well in foreground elements. When you start to reuse images like that in the background, you have to flatten them out a little bit with that atmospheric diffusion like what you saw me do with those trees up in the top left cliff. Now we're getting somewhere, and I wanted to do a gradient effect. This is not a gradient map, it's just a gradient over the top of everything. And then I'm going to maybe adjust a little bit of more green into those mid-tones basically. By setting that gradient to an overlay layer, I'm allowing myself to create a little bit more cohesion of the color vibes across the whole image. The beautiful thing about having that gradient on another layer, by the way, is that you can change the color. You can hit Command U, and that will allow you to change the hue. So if you wanted to bring in a little bit more warm colors into your mid-tones or something like that, pretty easy to do, especially if you keep that gradient on another layer. And you can see the difference when I switch on and switch off that gradient layer. Now it's all about dressing up what we have, so I'm gonna go in with an airbrush and hit it with a new layer in between these trees to create a little bit of atmosphere, as if the glow and atmosphere of these water particles in the air, the mist, is bouncing up underneath these trees in the foreground too. I mean, this is a handy trick for really separating out objects in your landscape paintings. Even with that big tree over on the left, I can go in behind it and add in a little bit of fog behind it to really make it pop out too. Clearly, as you can see, having all of your different elements on different layers can be really useful for making sure that you're getting good readability. And one thing that I want to recommend is that you stop for a moment and zoom way out on your image. And you want to be able to make sure that everything is reading really clearly, that nothing is really getting lost, that you can understand what it is that you're looking at from a thumbnail. That's going to really give you an indicator as to whether or not your painting is working. Again, as we've established, there's going to be a lot more detail and contrast in the foreground. So if you have something like this large rock formation with this tree over here on the left side, it seems like a good opportunity to really play up some of the details of these rocks, because it gets us a closer look at what kind of rocks are in this environment. And I want to really emphasize that underlighting. So you'll notice like I've hit this bottom of this foreground rock with like a nice underlit light, where maybe the light from the chasm is bouncing up onto it. I've got a custom brush that I use for these bushes, and these are sort of like it's my bush brush. And I've got some vines. These are actually roots from that big old tree that are sticking out from the side of the rock face. And also I wanted to simplify a little bit of the shaping of some of my foliage and make sure that none of those selections are left too sloppy. It's okay to have some messy areas if they're not the focal point and if your lines are confident, but the areas where people are going to be looking, I think it's important to have some strong lines. And it's that combination of sort of riding the chaos and keeping it nice and tidy and orderly that's going to give your whole painting a little bit of a feeling of, I guess, that refined painterly look. The magic sauce of landscape painting is in chaos of sloppy, messy brushstrokes matching a very nice, clean, tidy, intentional look. Of course, the most ideal way to get this is to start working with really fat brushes and then refine as you get closer and closer to details. That's when you start to get in there with the tinier brushes. A lot of what you're seeing me do right here is really just the variety and cleanup stuff. It's like everything's in place. Now it's just a matter of adding neat little things like little hanging lanterns and really tidying up some of those bushes so that all the trees look different and things like that. All right, now we're ready for the most important part of the painting process, the signature. This is the same signature that I've had since I was 13 years old, okay? But it's very important to put your name on your work. A lot of times I see amazing artwork from artists, they don't even sign their work. And there you have it, man. That's pretty much the short version of, most of my favorite landscape painting techniques and tricks that I've developed over the years. I am a self-taught artist. I never really went to art school to learn how to do this. Most of it's just, tips and tricks that I picked up from using Photoshop for like 20 years or so. I certainly hope that there was something, if nothing else, just at least one or two things that maybe you picked up from this that you could apply to your own workflow. Of course, I have tons of tutorials on my own YouTube channel. I really look forward to seeing your entries for this year's competition, and I want to thank MSI for inviting me to be a judge in this year's competition. And get your entries in, follow the details below this video, and I look forward to seeing your entries. Good luck, everyone.